Hello everyone and welcome to Big Flick Energy. While this month is flooded with films I could make ideas for or theories on, I wanted to discuss something a little different this time around, and it's on my gripe with award shows like the Oscars. You see, I used to love watching the Oscars even when I didn't know much about the films there, and I actually think knowing less of the films was a better experience, because as I learned more about all the films nominated, I begin to disagree more and more with the awards given. The problem is the people who select the awards. I used to think they were film critics, and since I disagree with what critics say on a lot of films and tend to agree more with fans, I'm bound to disagree with the films that receive these awards. But then I found out it's worse than critics. It is instead
the Academy.
The Academy. A group comprised of actors and directors in the industry, which are kind of like a cult of the most famous and influential people in film, where it sounds logical for them to choose given they are the most involved with these projects, but that's actually its biggest problem. They know all of these actors and directors are bound to have bias in who is chosen for certain awards. There's a lot of evidence of this bias as well, where in the past it was very rare to see minorities win these awards like people with origins in Asia or Africa, to the point where the first ever Asian woman to win Best Actress was Michelle Yeoh earlier this week, which I do think she deserved it. So there's a history of racial bias of these award shows, but luckily that's gone now. However, that doesn't mean all bias is gone. Just because minorities are winning doesn't mean the Academy said we need to be less biased. No, they said we need to not look as racist to the world. They are still biased, and I believe part of that bias comes in play with rules for films being nominated for awards rather than all films being eligible, alongside falling viewership for the Oscars. In terms of viewership, 2014 was the high of the 2010s at 43.7 million viewers, but that number has progressively dropped, with 2015 at 36.6 million, 2016 and 17 in the low 30s, 18 and 19 in the high 20s, 2020 at 23.6 million, 2021 at 10.4 million, which is an all-time low. Viewership is going down due to a combination of social media allowing us to see these celebrities whenever we want instead of on one day a year, alongside the impact of films like Marvel on the excitement individuals have for other films, which is partially why so many directors can't stand Marvel. This is why so many people thought Will Smith slapping Chris Rock was planned and was a ploy to get more viewers for the Oscars. Now, while that slap was mostly proven to not be planned out, it doesn't mean the Academy doesn't have strategies to try to get more viewers, and a lot of it goes back to the most awarded film of all time, Everything Everywhere All at Once, which just so happened to win Best Picture at the 2023 Oscars. Now, I actually did enjoy this film, but from films eligible for awards, I had 7 others above it, and for films nominated for Best Picture, I had 3 listed above it. But I still did enjoy it. I love the action in this film and the cinematography, but did take some points for story, primarily because of how weak the ending of the film was in comparison to the rest of the film. So that impacted how highly it was rated on my scale, and changing the end could have pushed this film to my top 3 of the year. One thing I did think was genius though, was the marketing of the film, which it received a full point for. This was because the first time I heard about this film was in theaters, where they showed this film's trailer before I watched Spider-Man No Way Home. As soon as I saw the trailer mention this being a multiverse film, I saw the genius behind this marketing ploy, given No Way Home was a multiverse movie that had so much hype going into it, that any film that even mentioned the multiverse would spark the interest of millions, which this film ultimately did. However, it does feel very coincidental that this film came out around the time of Marvel's multiverse saga starting up, and I firmly believe this film was planned by the Academy to perform well and get a ton of awards to help eventually bring higher viewership to the Oscars. I mean, I saw a lot more about the Oscars this year than I had in probably the previous 3 or 4 years, and I think a big part of that is because people knew the films that were nominated for the Best Picture of the year. It was the Academy's take on a superhero film, which is why it was marketed as such, but for some reason won so many awards, whereas superhero films are notorious for never getting nominations. I mean, the fact the Batman didn't receive a single nomination for the Oscars is pretty ridiculous considering it was loved by fans and critics alike, and stunning cinematography alongside great costume design and arguably the most impressive makeup work done for films eligible this year, not to mention an incredible score by a renowned composer in Michael Giacchino. And I'm not here to say superhero films are the best films, because no Marvel film nor The Batman were my number one film eligible for the Oscars. I love The Batman, and I wish that I could say that I loved the Marvel films that would have been eligible for these Oscars, but I would be lying to you. But I did love The Batman. But it's not my number one film. I don't think it deserved Best Picture. I think another film deserved Best Picture. But there is an evident bias against these superhero films from the Academy, which is comprised by, as mentioned before, many directors who are outspoken about superhero movies, like Martin Scorsese, who said these films are not cinema in his eyes, Ridley Scott, who said these films are boring and saved by special effects, and Quentin Tarantino, who said original films are at a war with superhero films. Now, back on track to when I heard about Everything Everywhere All at Once for the first time. Once No Way Home came to a conclusion, for some reason Everywhere All at Once continued to get marketed to an extent I had only seen superhero films get marketed to. I don't know how it got this funding and had so many people talking about it weeks or months before it's released, but it did. The movie was released, and to nobody's surprise, people began speaking extremely highly about it. So I had to check it out, and while I enjoyed it, like mentioned before, I thought it had its own issues. Watching it and now seeing how well it performed in front of the Academy and how it marketed itself like a superhero film, I look at this film as the Academy's take on a superhero film, where they themselves helped push this film to new heights as a film fans could watch that had everything they enjoy in a superhero film. But it's not a cinematic experience killer like what so many of these members of the Academy think Marvel films are. Instead, they pushed a film more people would watch in comparison to previous years, where films like Parasite would win, where many fans wouldn't even know of those movies until watching the Oscars. Instead, we all knew this film going into the Oscars, and I think having this film be like a superhero film but checking off all the boxes of the Academy was low-key done by the Academy as a way to try and get more viewers. And once again, I did enjoy the film. But given the lack of rep of the directors attached, where the Daniels only have one other feature film, which I have never heard about and was thought of as merely a decent film by fans and critics alike, it seems like this film had no logical reason to be fantastic, which I attribute to some potential interference in the side of the Academy to help build their Mecha Godzilla to fend off the kaiju that is Marvel. So I guess for simplicity's sake, I'll call Everything Everywhere All at Once Mecha Marvel from now on. And to top it all off, it seemed way too obvious who was about to win the award for Best Picture when Harrison Ford came up to announce it, considering Harrison Ford and Ke Huy Quan had a moment so many fans wanted to see, given they worked together on Indiana Jones many years ago. It just felt very scripted overall. And look, I love Ke Huy Quan. I'm very happy that he won the award, and I thought that he did great in the film, but having Harrison Ford there did feel scripted. Everybody was talking 2 or 3 days before the Oscars about how Everything Everywhere All at Once was already the most awarded film of all time. And then this just takes you into the Oscars where they continued winning awards. It just felt like it was planned from the start. Now, I know this video is running long, but I do need to say that while earlier I mentioned racial bias is gone, that's sadly not the case. It is returning to the Oscars in 2024, where films going for Best Picture must have one of these 3 things. At least one lead or significant supporting actor from an underrepresented racial or ethnic group, at least 30% of a cast in secondary and minor roles from 2 underrepresented identity groups, or a main storyline or subject that centers on underrepresented identity groups. Now, I believe films should show society in the most realistic way possible, so have no problem with having actors who are in ethnic minority groups or gay characters in certain projects. Like if it's a story that takes place in the modern United States, it's illogical to have everybody look one specific way, unless if it's from a community like, let's say I'm from Miami. So if it's like Miami, it makes sense to have the majority of the people be Hispanic. But in a lot of situations, like if it's New York, you can make the case that it should be a perfect mix. You can go by the ratio that the United States has of a certain percentage of white actors, certain percentage of black actors that make it seem exactly how it is in the real world. So I have no problem with doing things like this. But I want to call forth a film like The Northman versus The Woman King. So The Northman, this is an incredible film which came out not too long ago, taking place in the age of the Vikings. Both The Northman and The Woman King show stories with primarily one group of people as period pieces. The difference is, one of the films shows an African story and the other shows a Viking story, where you can tell the story of The Woman King 100% accurately to the period and not have to change the story at all because of how much of the cast is black, and that'll fit perfectly under the Oscars nomination chart, where you will not need to make a single change for that story and it could still be nominated. On the other hand, you have a film like The Northman that would need to be altered if it wants an award, even though it is critically and publicly a better film than The Woman King. Because The Northman, as I mentioned, takes place in the age of the Vikings, and you didn't have Asians crossing paths with the Vikings, you didn't have Africans crossing paths with the Vikings, Hispanics crossing paths with the Vikings. So that is something that wouldn't make sense to tell in a story like The Northman, but it's going to be forced into stories like that, or else people aren't going to see it as the best picture of the year, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Making films ineligible for being known as Best Picture changes what the award actually is. It's not the best movie of the year at that point. That's aside from the fact that, even in the past, it's the actual studio that needs to push films for certain awards instead of all films just being eligible for all awards. I understand it's impossible to watch every film made in a year, but that's where critics and fans come into play, where you can cut the films viewed to ones with a specific rating rather than cutting it based on how many minorities you have in a film, or based on whether the studio wants to push the film for Oscar recognition or not. I mean, at this point, award shows like this remind me of the scene from Hunger Games, where the world meets the tributes and it even looks like an award show, especially when you look at a host like Jimmy Kimmel, who not many people find funny, but he for some reason has connections with all of these actors, so of course he's the first person the Academy goes to for hosting not once, not twice, but 3 times. So I just don't watch these award shows anymore, because if the people deciding on these awards are voting based on how progressive a film is, rather than its quality, and are preventing films from winning awards because they think it destroys the cinematic experience, even though they bring in more fans to theaters than ever before, that's not a cult I'm willing to believe in. So let me know what you all think, whether I'm right about the Oscars still having bias in its selections, the future of racial bias in the Oscars, and how Everything Everywhere All at Once is a film made by the Academy as a strategy to get more Oscars viewership, where the awards this film would receive were probably known before the film was ever even released. Thank you, and see you next time on Big Flick Energy.